Hello comrades, welcome to Soviet Journey. In this video, I will tell you about the influence and historical legacy of Leonid Brezhnev, who served as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union between 1964 and 1982 and was twice elected as the chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet in the Soviet Union. During his term in office, Brezhnev transformed the Soviet Union into a powerful actor in world politics as a superpower through his role in international relations and his methods in defense policies. After he took office, the growth rates of the Soviet economy increased and with it the quality of life in the country. He gave special importance to agricultural policies, provided state incentives for agricultural areas and ensured that Soviet agriculture was highly supported. His refusal to favor sudden changes in state policies and his meticulousness in making decisions by consensus with the Communist Party Politburo and bureaucracy resulted in lasting political stability within the party and the country. His actions ensured that Brezhnev was remembered positively. Brezhnev signed many agreements aimed at easing international relations and maintaining peace. On the other hand, it played a major role in the development of the Red Army by increasing the spending on the Soviet Army. As a result, the Soviet Army increased its influence as a force in international politics. On the one hand, he supported communist uprisings in governments around the world, while on the other hand, with the so-called Brezhnev Doctrine, he advocated the military suppression of movements aimed at the reconstruction of capitalism that emerged in the Eastern Bloc. According to this doctrine, aggressive developments aimed at the restoration of capitalism in a country where socialism existed concerned not only that country, but all socialist countries, and it was announced that the solution of these problems could not be left to that country alone. As a result, during the Brezhnev period, the Soviet Army was sent to the Eastern Bloc countries that were on the path to capitalism in an attempt to eliminate these dangers. Yes, comrades, I gave you a summary like this at the beginning of the video. Brezhnev's influence on the Soviet Union is much greater than it is thought. Now, let's take a brief look at the events that took place during the Brezhnev period and examine Brezhnev's historical legacy together. Well, friends, in this section we will talk a little about the economic developments during the Brezhnev period. During this period, the greatest visible developments in the economy occurred in agriculture, and agricultural production increased significantly. Brezhnev's agricultural policy was based on the strengthening of collectivized agriculture. He implemented a policy of greater farm consolidation, thinking that this would increase productivity and increase state investment in farms. In the 1970s, 27% of state investments were transferred to agriculture, and the resources transferred to agriculture reached the highest level in the country's history. For example, in 1981 alone, $33.1 billion was invested in agriculture. Agricultural production in 1980 was 21% higher than average production rates between 1966 and 1970. During this period, grain production increased by 18%. Brezhnev refused to sign trade agreements with the United States, but negotiated agreements with other Western countries. The trade was necessary because there was a significant shortage of forage crops produced in the Soviet Union. To solve these problems, Brezhnev increased state investment. On the other hand, the industry has also developed. Under the 8th five-year plan, the production of factories and mines increased by 138% compared to 1969. Then, during the 9th five-year plan period, the production rates of industrial consumer goods increased. Thus, consumer goods such as watches, furniture, and radios were produced in abundance. During the Brezhnev period, per capita consumption increased by 70%. The Soviet Union grew economically at a rate that could easily catch up with the United States and Western Europe. Advanced technologies, especially in nuclear technology, radio communications, agriculture, and heavy industry, played a key role in the country's economic development. The Soviet economy grew at a rate that was both faster than the US economy and consistently the same as that of Western European economies until the 1970s. In the early 1970s, the Soviet Union had the world's second largest industrial capacity and produced more steel, oil, iron, cement, and tractors than any other country. In fact, thanks to Soviet aid, some Eastern Bloc countries achieved economic growth rates higher than the Soviet Union. In the early 1970s, the process of catching up with Western countries economically slowed down. A period called the stagnation period in the literature began. The beginning of this economic recession coincided with the financial crisis in Western Europe and the United States. There are many reasons for the recession period, which is accepted to have started in 1973. Many events took place during this period, such as the costly arms race between the two superpowers, the USSR and the USA, the Soviet Union's decision to abandon the idea of economic isolation and participate in international trade, the economic repercussions of military policies such as the suppression of the Prague Spring in 1968 and the intervention in Afghanistan, internal bureaucracy problems and political corruption. As a result of the high expenditure on the Soviet military and the reduction of budget allocations for light industry and consumer goods, Soviet economic growth in numerical terms was lower than in Western countries. Agricultural production theoretically met the food needs of the urban population less than in previous periods. However, the high quality of life that the government described as maturing socialism continued to be maintained and social services increased significantly. For example, workers' holiday rights were brought to high standards. Many recreational facilities were built for citizens and regular holiday rights were granted. Many similar qualities were clearly visible in social life. On the other hand, Mikhail Gorbachev, who later took the same position, criticized Brezhnev's economic policies and described the post-1973 period as the lower stage of socialism. During Brezhnev's 18 years as leader of the Soviet Union, per capita income rose by 50%, with 3/4 of that growth occurring in the 1960s and early 1970s. During the recession, growth rates of Soviet gross national product in the 1970s began to lag behind the levels of the 1950s and 1960 seconds. In other words, this rapid growth gave way to stagnation after 1973. That is why Gorbachev called this period the period of stagnation. In this part of our video, we will talk about Brezhnev's policies. Brezhnev generally followed a policy of relaxation. In other words, international politics, which was full of tensions in the past, has entered a phase of softening. Agreements were reached on arms control, crisis prevention, trade between Eastern and Western countries, European security and human rights. But on the other hand, Brezhnev considered it extremely important to equalize the military power of the Soviet Union and the United States. Between 1965 and 1970, the Brezhnev administration's defense spending increased by 40% and periodic annual increases continued thereafter. In 1982, the year Brezhnev died, 15% of gross national product was spent on the Soviet army. Brezhnev's basic ideas regarding the army were as follows. The army should be strengthened in a way that will adapt it to military threats and military operations that change according to the circumstances. In order to have a say in the ongoing conflict-oriented course of global politics, various military tools must be possessed. Be prepared to participate in regional conflicts of any size, anywhere in the world. Brezhnev's main view was around the rules gathered in these three articles. In the 1970s, the USSR reached the peak of its political and strategic power in relations with the United States. SALT I, the first agreement of the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, ensured the equality of nuclear weapons between the two superpowers. The Helsinki Final Act legitimized Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and defeat in Vietnam weakened US's prestige. Brezhnev and US President Nixon signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which prohibited both countries from designing systems to intercept future missiles and prevented the US and USSR from shooting at each other. During the Brezhnev period, the Soviet Union expanded its diplomatic and political influence in the Middle East and Africa. We can say that these are among the most important international policies of the Brezhnev period. The USA government thought that these military agreements and improved trade between the two countries during the Brezhnev era would stop the growth of communism in third world countries. However, the opposite happened. The Soviet Union actively supported communist forces fighting against the United States in the Vietnam War, which the United States lost. Moreover, after the Vietnam War, communist governments were also established in Cambodia and Laos. Later, as foreign policy became more aggressive towards the USSR and the communist world, anti-communist governments and organizations began to be funded by the United States. Following the Sino-Soviet border conflict in 1969, the United States began to develop relations with Communist China due to its differences and opposition to the Soviets. All of these were historical events corresponding to the Brezhnev period. While Brezhnev pursued a policy of balance with the Western world, he followed a hard-line stance on the internal political problems of the communist world. In 1968, when the Czechoslovak government implemented liberal reforms and embarked on the path of restoration of capitalism, the Warsaw Pact, led by the Soviet Union, intervened militarily in the country and the government was changed. Following the intervention, Brezhnev proclaimed the Brezhnev Doctrine, which stated that the Soviet Union had the right to intervene against any allied communist state that attempted to restore capitalism. Accordingly, aggressive developments aimed at re-establishing capitalism in a socialist country are problems that concern not only this country, but all social countries. For this reason, the solution to such vital problems cannot be left to that country alone, and efforts must be made to eliminate all threats, including armed intervention. Brezhnev made the following statement at the 5th Congress of the Polish United Workers' Party. "It is known to everyone that the Soviet Union has done everything to strengthen the sovereignty and independence of all socialist countries. Our Communist Party respects the different ways each socialist country develops towards socialism according to its own unique national conditions. But comrades, as you all know, the general outlines of the process of building socialism are clear. Stepping outside this line will lead to a step back from socialism." Considering that internal and external forces hostile to socialism are trying to bring back the capitalist system, it can be seen that the threat to socialism in one country becomes a problem that threatens the entire socialist community. The problem is no longer just a problem for the people of that country, but a common problem for all socialist countries. This doctrine received a lot of criticism from the international communist movement. Tensions increased not only with the Eastern Bloc countries, but also with the communist states in Asia, and arguments were put forward that the USSR could pose a threat to their independence. By 1969, relations with other communist countries had deteriorated to such a degree that Brezhnev was unable to gather even 5 of the 14 communist parties that governed the state to attend an international conference in Moscow. However, this doctrine was not always put into practice. After the emergence of the anti-communist solidarity movement in Poland in 1980, disagreements arose about what to do about this development. The USSR and the Eastern Bloc did not decide immediately. East German leader Erich Honecker proposed joint military measures to resolve the problems in Poland in accordance with the declared doctrine in an official letter to Brezhnev. Then, in 1980 and 1981, Eastern Bloc parliamentary deputies met in Moscow to discuss the situation. Brezhnev told Polish delegates on December 10, 1981, that the Soviet Union could do so if desired, but that it would be better for Poland to resolve its internal affairs itself. This situation showed that the Soviet Union would not apply the Brezhnev doctrine in all cases. Even the party's second secretary, Mikhail Suslov, stated that they would not be able to provide military aid to Poland. Poland then dissolved the country without Soviet intervention, using martial law on December 12, 1981. Similarly, in 1980, when Yuri Andropov was a member of the Politburo, he informed Raul Castro, one of the leaders of the Cuban Revolution, that the Soviet Union would not fight militarily for Cuba. On the other hand, relations between China and the Soviet Union deteriorated during the Khrushchev period after Stalin, and the Chinese government accused the USSR of moving away from revolutionism and taking a reactionary path. In response to the Brezhnev-era Soviet government's policies of rejecting Stalin's legacy and living in peace with capitalist countries, in the 1960s, the Chinese government launched the Cultural Revolution with the aim of reviving the revolutionary spirit. Brezhnev expressed that he did not understand why Mao would initiate such a self-destructive method that could end the socialist revolution. During the Brezhnev era, differences of opinion between the Soviet Union and China led to tensions and even border disputes. In 1969, Chinese army forces crossed the border into the Soviet Union, initiating border clashes and rising tensions between the two countries. Although Brezhnev called for normalization of relations, the two countries did not fully normalize until the Gorbachev era. Brezhnev struggled with many diseases. Heart disease, leukemia, jaw cancer, emphysema, poor circulation, and obesity were present and were exacerbated by smoking. Sometimes he could not even attend some meetings due to health problems. He was rarely seen in public until 1982, the year he died. Despite being reported by doctors to be in poor health, he insisted that he was fine. In May 1982, he suffered a severe seizure, but did not seek intensive treatment until the heart attack that would cause his death. Brezhnev suffered a heart attack on November 10, 1982, and died at the age of 75. Brezhnev's death deeply affected the majority of the Soviet people, and 5 days of mourning were declared throughout the country. Heads of state and representatives from countries around the world attended the funeral. Time magazine wrote that the majority of the Soviet people mourned Brezhnev's death. Brezhnev was generally remembered as a leader who fought to resolve international tensions and save humanity from the threatening nuclear war, and his peaceful policies were always praised. During Brezhnev's term in office, political corruption had increased and it had become a major problem in the Soviet Union's economy. After Brezhnev's death, Yuri Andropov was elected General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and launched a large-scale anti-corruption campaign across the country. He criticized the ideological indifference and personal tolerance of the authorities during the Brezhnev era. Then, with the perestroika policy initiated during the Gorbachev period, severe economic and political criticism of the Brezhnev period began to be directed. Gorbachev called the 1970s the era of stagnation. However, Gorbachev later stated that the period in question was not as bad as it was said. Following his death, Brezhnev's family came under harsh political criticism. His family members, Yuri Brezhnev, Galina Brezhneva and Yuri Chabanov, were subjected to intensive investigation. Except for Galina, the family members were arrested on charges of political corruption during the Gorbachev era. Chabanov was sentenced to 12 years in prison on charges of large-scale embezzlement and corruption, stripped of all state honors until December 1988 and sent to a labor camp. Galina, along with the rest of the Brezhnev family, lost her state rights. In December 1988, the city, which had been called Brezhnev since 1982, was renamed back to its former name, Naberezhny Chelny, and in accordance with the decree of the Soviet government, all towns, streets, factories and institutions named after Brezhnev were renamed. His grandson, Andrei Brezhnev, said that the name Brezhnev became a curse for the family. Family members were fired from their jobs and their friends abandoned them. It was decided that his role in World War II had been exaggerated, and on September 21, 1989, the Order of Victory, the highest military decoration awarded for war honors, was revoked. In many surveys conducted in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Brezhnev era was mentioned positively. On the other hand, it has been frequently stated that stability was lost during the Gorbachev and Yeltsin periods. In a survey conducted, when asked which period of Russian history in the 20th century would you like to live in, the majority of Russians answered Brezhnev. Another survey found that the Brezhnev era was the best period for ordinary people in the 20th century and that it was the most stable and prosperous period in Russia. So, comrades, in this video, I wanted to convey to you the impact and historical legacy of Leonid Brezhnev, who is little known and little written about, but during his term in office, many developments took place. I hope you liked it. There are few sources and such content about Brezhnev. I think this video will contribute to this topic. I produce many videos on such little-known topics about the Soviet Union. Please do not forget to follow and subscribe to our Soviet Journey channel for similar content. I'm waiting for your comments below. Goodbye for now. Stay in solidarity.